Imagine you wake up one morning. You own a flower, just a single flower bulb, sitting in the ground, not even bloomed yet. And that bulb is worth more than your house. Not a small house, a well-furnished canal-side Amsterdam house. You haven't done anything special, you haven't built a company, you haven't invented anything. You just bought a tulip bulb. And somehow, in the winter of 1637 Holland, that made you rich. Until it didn't. This is the story of Tulip Mania, the world's first recorded financial bubble. A story about human greed, mass hysteria, and a flower that came very close to bankrupting an entire nation. Or at least that's the story you've been told. Because here's the twist. A large part of what you think you know about Tulip Mania is actually a myth, and the real story is somehow even more interesting. Let's get into it. To understand Tulip Mania, you first need to understand where it happened, because this wasn't just any country at any time. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was arguably the most economically advanced civilization on Earth. Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the first multinational corporation in history, and at its peak, it was worth more than Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined in today's money, roughly $8 trillion. Let that sink in. The Dutch had invented the modern stock exchange. They had a sophisticated banking system. They had futures contracts, options trading, insurance markets, financial tools that the rest of the world wouldn't catch up with for another 2 centuries. And crucially, they had money, a lot of it. Per capita income in the Dutch Republic was the highest in the entire world from around 1600 to 1720. Ordinary merchants, skilled craftsmen, even some laborers had surplus income for the first time, and they were looking for somewhere to put it. And the tulips. Tulips aren't originally Dutch. They came from Central Asia, from the steppes of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, cultivated for centuries in the Ottoman Empire, where they were symbols of paradise and divine beauty. In the 1590s, a Flemish botanist named Charles de la Cosse brought tulip bulbs to the Netherlands. And the Dutch, who at this point were already obsessed with exotic goods from their global trade empire, fell completely in love with them. But here's what made tulips truly special, and this is something most people don't know. The most prized tulips had a defect. They were called broken tulips, bulbs that produced flowers with wild, flame-like streaks of color across the petals, red bleeding into white, purple bursting through yellow. They looked almost painted, completely unlike anything Europe had seen before. Nobody knew why some tulips broke and others didn't. Growers tried everything, different soils, different fertilizers, even superstitious rituals. Some mixed pigments into the soil, hoping the flower would absorb the color. The answer, which they wouldn't discover for centuries, was a virus. A mosaic virus carried by aphids that infected the bulb and caused the spectacular color patterns. The most beautiful tulips were literally diseased. And because nobody could reliably reproduce them, each broken tulip was essentially unique, one of a kind, which made them extraordinarily valuable. By the early 3060s, a single bulb of the rarest varieties was worth more than most people earned in a year. And then the speculation began. Here's where it gets really interesting from an economic perspective, because Tulip Mania didn't just create a bubble, it accidentally invented an entire financial system. Tulip bulbs can only be safely dug up and traded during summer, from June to September. The flowers bloom for just a week in spring, so for most of the year, you literally couldn't trade the physical bulb. Dutch merchants solved this problem by creating futures contracts. You would sign a piece of paper agreeing to buy a specific bulb at a specific price for delivery the following summer. The bulb was still in the ground. You were buying a promise. And then you could sell that promise to someone else, who could sell it to someone else. 10 times a day, the same bulb contract could change hands. Nobody was actually interested in the tulip. They were interested in the contract, in the price going up. Sound familiar? This is essentially what happens in modern derivatives markets, in crypto, in NFTs. The Dutch in 1636 were doing something we still do today. By 1634, the French had developed such a craving for tulips that it pulled even more Dutch speculators into the market. Ordinary people, not just wealthy merchants, started getting involved. A single bulb of the Semper August, the most coveted variety, reached a price of 6,000 guilders. That's roughly the cost of a luxurious Amsterdam canal house, or about 12 years of a skilled craftsman's salary. At the absolute peak of the frenzy, tulip prices rose 20-fold in a single month, January 1637. People were selling everything, furniture, houses, land, to buy bulbs. The contracts were trading in taverns, in churches, in the back rooms of inns. And then, in a single week in February 1637, it was all over. The crash didn't start with a dramatic announcement, no government intervention, no scandal, no war. It started with an empty room. In early February 1637, a routine tulip auction was held in Haarlem. The auctioneer put up the first lot. Nobody bid. He lowered the price. Still nobody. He lowered it again. The room was silent. Word spread instantly, because in a small, tightly connected merchant community, word always spreads instantly. The buyers had simply stopped believing. That fragile, invisible thing that holds every bubble together had snapped. Within days, tulip bulbs were selling for 1 to 5% of what they had been worth a week earlier. Contracts that people had signed for thousands of guilders were now worth nothing. Dealers refused to honor their agreements. The courts were flooded with disputes. The Dutch government's response? They basically shrugged and told everyone to work it out themselves. The Provincial Court of Holland suggested the parties talk it out. Eventually, they ruled that buyers could cancel contracts by paying just 3.5% of the original price. And just like that, the world's first financial bubble was over.
Now, here's the part where the story gets really interesting, because everything I just described is real. The prices, the contracts, the crash, all documented. But the legendary version of Tulip Mania, the one where entire families lost everything, where chimney sweeps and peasants gambled their life savings, where people threw themselves into canals in despair, that version is almost entirely fiction, and we know exactly where it came from. Right after the crash in 1637, Dutch satirists did what Dutch satirists do. They wrote vicious, funny pamphlets mocking the people who had speculated in tulips. There were songs, poems, and illustrations depicting foolish merchants trading with monkeys. One famous painting by Jan Bruegel the Younger shows monkeys dealing in tulips while one urinates on the now worthless flowers. It was savage social commentary. 2 centuries later, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay stumbled on these satirical pamphlets and took them completely at face value. He included the tulip story in his 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And because Mackay was a compelling writer and his book became a classic, the myth stuck. Historian Anne Goldgar spent years in Dutch archives and found the truth. She identified fewer than 350 people who actually participated in the tulip trade. Almost all of them were wealthy merchants and skilled artisans, people who could comfortably afford to speculate. She could not find a single documented case of someone going bankrupt specifically because of tulips, not one. The Dutch economy? Completely unaffected. The Dutch Republic remained the wealthiest nation on earth for another 80 years after Tulip Mania. So why does the myth persist? Because, as Goldgar puts it, It's a great story. And the reason it's a great story is that it makes people look stupid. Here's my take on this, and I think it's more interesting than either the myth or the simple debunking. Yes, the economic damage was limited. Yes, the participants were mostly wealthy enough to absorb the losses. But that doesn't mean nothing significant happened. What Tulip Mania really was the world's first documented episode of speculative psychology. The first time in recorded history that we can clearly see how a market completely detaches from reality, not because of fraud, not because of war, but simply because of collective belief. Think about what actually drove the prices. It wasn't that tulips suddenly became more useful. It wasn't that the economy fundamentally changed. It was purely the belief that the next person would pay more than you did, a self-fulfilling prophecy, until it wasn't. And there were real structural reasons it got as far as it did. The futures contracts meant you didn't need cash to speculate. You just needed to sign a piece of paper. Leverage, in other words. The boom in prosperity meant there was surplus money looking for returns. The plague of 1636 created a strange nothing-to-lose mentality in some people, and there was genuine uncertainty about the rare broken tulips. Since nobody understood why they occurred, their value was truly impossible to calculate. How do you value something unique and unreproducible? These are all conditions we see in every bubble since. The 1920s stock market, the 2000 dot-com crash, the 2008 housing crisis, crypto in 2021, NFTs, meme stocks. The asset changes, the psychology doesn't. Every generation thinks it invented financial stupidity. Every generation is wrong. The Dutch of the 1630s were not fools. They were, in many ways, the most financially sophisticated people on earth at the time. They built the first modern financial system. They ran the most successful trading empire in history. And they still got caught up in a speculative frenzy over flowers. That should tell you something important. These bubbles don't happen because people are dumb. They happen because human beings are wired for a specific kind of social reasoning. If everyone around me is getting rich off this thing, and smart people I respect are buying it, then I should buy it too. And the fact that the price keeps going up feels like proof that the reasoning is correct. It works until the moment the collective belief stops. And that moment is impossible to predict. Nobody rang a bell at the Harlem auction. Nobody sent a warning. One day, buyers just stopped showing up. There's also a subtler lesson here that I find really compelling. The real Tulip Mania, stripped from the myths, was actually a relatively contained event. The people involved were wealthy enough to handle the losses. The Dutch economy absorbed it without major damage. The dangerous bubbles in history are the ones that suck in people who genuinely cannot afford to lose, the 2008 housing crisis being the perfect example. When banks packaged subprime mortgages into complex derivatives and sold them globally, they took a speculative mania and weaponized it against ordinary families who just wanted to own a home. That's when bubbles stop being financial curiosities and start being genuine catastrophes. Tulip Mania, for all its mythology, was not that, but it was the canary in the coal mine. The first proof that modern financial markets could generate irrational price explosions completely disconnected from underlying value. And we've been relearning that lesson ever since. So let's bring it all together. Tulip Mania happened in the Dutch Golden Age, the richest, most financially advanced society the world had ever seen. A flower from the Ottoman Empire became the world's most coveted status symbol. Clever merchants invented futures contracts to trade it year-round. Prices detached from reality, and then, on a cold February morning in Harlem in 1637, someone sat down at an auction and simply didn't bid. The famous disaster story, ruined families, mass bankruptcies, a nation brought to its knees, is largely a myth, built from satirical pamphlets and repeated uncritically for 4 centuries. But the real story is arguably more important because it shows us for the first time in recorded history how markets can generate collective delusions, how speculation creates its own reality until it doesn't, and how the specific psychology that drives bubbles is not a flaw in human nature that can be engineered away. It's a fundamental feature of how we think. The tulip was just a flower, but what it revealed about human behavior has echoed through every financial crisis since. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, subscribe for more economic history, because as it turns out, the past is the best guide we have to the financial chaos of the present. See you in the next video.